Welcome to the Steve Barkley Ponders Out Loud podcast. As instructional coaches and school leaders, you are tasked with guiding continuous teacher growth to create student success. This podcast looks to support you with strategies from experienced guests, as well as my own insights that I've gathered over the years. I'm thrilled to have you with us. Thanks for tuning in. Supporting teacher well-being. I'm pleased to have a returning guest to our podcast today. Keith Young is an education coach, leadership trainer, and author focused on transforming instructional leadership and classroom culture. After varied teaching and leadership work internationally and across the U.S., Keith founded AKY Consulting, based on the South Carolina coast. Keith is the author of the Instructional Coaching Handbook and the Confident Classroom Management Moves deck card, which provides teacher-tested scripted strategies for relationally centered discipline. On the earlier podcast, Keith shared classroom management strategies built on deliberate care, practiced calmness, and keeping both teachers and students safe and thriving. I'll post the link to that podcast in this podcast lead-in. Keith is now the co-author of a just-released book, the Teaching Strategy Handbook, 200-plus solutions for common classroom challenges. As I look through the 10 chapters of his book, I selected Chapter 8, Teacher Burnout and Stress, for our podcast conversation today. Since many educators are awaiting the start of a new school year, I thought this would be a good topic so that teacher leaders, instructional coaches, and administrators could be planning for prevention rather than waiting for stressors to build. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm glad to be here again.
Super to have you back. So, for starters, what led to Chapter 8 being part of the material you selected for the book?
Well, we did, the entire book is based on what are the current highest needs of teachers. We consulted the RAND study and some other things that we list in the introduction, and they identified about 6 or 8 things that teachers nationally are saying are problems that they're encountering on a regular basis. This is post-pandemic. This is current research. So teacher burnout and stress came up as one of those highest needs. And it's also something that the co-authors and we work in schools regularly across the nation. We're in just over 1,000 classrooms each year. And it's also one of the topics that we see that teachers regularly report as something that is stressful to them right now. Burnout, stress, just being overwhelmed in general with work, whether it's the pressure to produce specific test scores or to manage the students that they have, or the demands that they have as public school educators. That's one of the topics that came up quite frequently in our work and in the current research on what's stressing teachers.
So, am I on the right track when I suggest that we need to be looking at prevention planning rather than, or I guess in addition to quote treatment? And I'm wondering if that prevention planning is both leaders' roles in it as well as teachers' in individual roles.
Agreed. I do think it's a systemic issue. It's also an individual teacher issue. It's something that I believe teachers have to look at and focus on what they can control, what they can't control. And working across the nation in a variety of districts and a variety of states, I do see some systemic issues that are there. This book was written particularly for teachers individually, so strategies that they can do. So it focuses on what the individual teacher can do. So when we look at that chapter on teacher burnout and stress, we have a lot of strategies in there for the teacher to focus on, to make sure they're taking care of their mental health, to make sure that they're, organizing themselves, that they have effective communication skills. but there are also some strategies to help them either influence and or change the systems that they're caught up in. So I want to say we align on that it is both a systemic and leadership issue at the school level, at the district level, at the state level. It's also an individual teacher issue. I think you have to look at all of them in tandem.
We'll get in later to the other areas of the book that you address, but based on what you just said there about strategies for teachers, it sounds like your book is a resource that instructional coaches would make sense to look at. I'm almost hearing it as what's some strategies I can turn to when a teacher has such and such an issue.
Definitely. I think it's a valuable book for individual teachers. I think it helps give instructional coaches a repertoire of strategies they can use when they're coaching teachers, even around burnout and stress, and educational leaders as well, administrators, principals, assistant principals. We're getting early feedback. The book just came out in May, but we're getting early feedback that all of those groups, educational leaders, instructional coaches, and teachers are finding it valuable, mainly because it broadens that. A lot of times I find coaches and administrators, they're looking for more strategies than what they used in order to coach or supervise a teacher. So this sort of broadens their bag of tricks. It broadens their repertoire. And every chapter focuses on a different set of problems that teachers often face. And it gives, literally the subtitle of the book is 200 strategies for problem solving. So it literally gives a list of strategies. And they're organized around low prep strategies, medium prep time, and high intensity prep time. So you can look quickly at something that might be a strategy that takes more long-term intervention. And you can also look at some things that you could do tomorrow in the classroom.
On an earlier podcast that I recorded with Dr. Chris Jensen, who is a experienced emergency room physician and an experienced high school science teacher, so made an interesting background.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a book called "Triage Your School: A Physician's Guide to Presenting Burnout." And he shared a concern that self-care was kind of putting a bandage on your day and not erasing the driving forces of what was causing the stress or a burnout. He suggested we need to establish a better climate, a sense of satisfaction, both as individual educators and those leading educators. I'm wondering how that aligns with some of the findings that you had.
I think it aligns really, really well. I think putting all of the onus on the teachers to be the only source of solving some of the problems for which they have little or no control over is an error. One of the strategies from our chapter on teacher burnout and stress has to do with appropriate use of professional learning communities. We encounter professional learning communities all over the place. Everybody is doing something titled a professional learning community. One of the things that as a team, there are 4 of us working on this, and it was vetted by teachers as well. One of the things that we notice is there are lots of definitions and lots of use of that time for PLCs. And I think one of the strategies that would align with the emergency room physician, former emergency room physician who's now a science teacher, would be looking at how those are being used. And we find that when we're observing and coaching for those PLCs, the teachers that are taking their time and have a really tight focus on the data that they're looking at and on their schedule, because they have to, there's only so many minutes to do this. When they focus on specific data with specific students' names and student work, and they look at what they did to get students successful with this standard or this, whatever it is that they measured, if they pause there and look at those things, they head off in the right direction for when they look at some of the errors for what happened to the students who didn't make it. And so whenever we're modeling PLCs, we're helping coaches, or we're helping to coach teacher leaders, we often start there, helping them with narrowing down how much data they're looking at and looking at it very carefully so that they can celebrate some of those successes. Many, many times we find that when they slow down and they look at the successes, the strategies that they were doing over there with things that work are actually strategies they need for the remedies on the other end of the spectrum where the students were struggling with the standard. So this careful look at PLCs, it addresses a couple of things. There's a couple of things that cause teachers to be stressed. One is isolation and one is efficacy. So if the PLC is done properly, it hits both of those drivers. It hits that affective driver so that the teacher doesn't feel so isolated. I can share what I did well, and I can get some help for some things that maybe didn't go so well. But then it also helps with that other driver. That's the efficacy driver. That's the one that has the research backing behind it that shows it to be a powerful strategy, the PLC, when done well, because that helps the teacher feel less powerless. All right. So if you can have a strategy that's like a well-run PLC that helps eliminate isolation and helps increase powerfulness or efficacy as a teacher, then you've got the potential often built into the system to actually work on the systems that often produce stress for teachers. So I think PLCs merit a careful diagnosis in terms of how they're used and how they can actually help decrease teacher burnout and stress.
There's two things that hit me there as I was listening to you. The term satisfaction. In other words, a teacher sensing satisfaction is a buildup. And when you described looking at what did we do that caused the kids who were successful to be successful, there's a part of reinforcing satisfaction there that now prepares me to say, okay, where do we need to do something else? And I think connected to that, as I was hearing you, I am real big on students. The real student needs to be part of that PLC conversation versus scores. And that's why I'm big for student work being on the table when teachers are in a PLC conversation, because there's a realness to the student's work that I find tends to be missing when we're just looking at the scores that came back in from some assessment we gave.
Exactly. So many times I'll see this. The teacher might say, well, they can't write, and they're not looking at the student writing. So maybe they had to do a short prompt, maybe they have to do a long piece of writing. But what did they actually write? Because often they wrote something. And so I have to know what they actually can produce, or at least attempting to produce, before I can say, okay, so what's the next step? They're not producing complete sentences. They're not using the mathematical terms. What is it they're doing? And I don't know that if I'm not looking at the writing. I have been in PLCs about writing where the teachers had no written work.
I'm sorry to laugh. It's a shocker, but I know how real it is.
Well, I was a little startled myself. This was a school in Tennessee, and they had great data graphics, and they had an assessment data warehouse. There was literally no student written work, and they had invested time. And I felt more sorry for them because I thought, well, where are the student products? I can look at these scores and they're going to say one thing, but I cannot give you much diagnosis without seeing what the students wrote, or at least a sample. Give me a couple of the high performing, mid performing, and low performing. Let's go up there. Let's look for some trends that'll better inform our decisions.
It's interesting because I've made the same connection with math. Looking at the scores kids had on math result, you got to be looking at what did the student do.
Yeah. I was just in a classroom last week, and their students were like, well, do I have to show my work? Yeah, I said, because that's going to show me your thinking. All right. And they kept pressing back. But when teachers regularly expect that, then they regularly show that. Now you can go in and diagnose, okay, you're going the right direction, but your calculations were off. you are going, you can see so many things that you can't see just from the one, correct or not correct answer. And
Well,
also, you
yeah, go
don't,
ahead.
another tip for helping with stress, you don't have to, in a PLC, often you don't have time, but you also don't have to look at every student example. If you can get,
Exactly.
as a coach or a department chair, if you can get some, 5 or 6, highest scoring
Yep.
students, and then 5 or 6 in the middle, then five or six at the bottom, you can, ahead of time, you can, stream down what the analysis needs to look like. I want to go
Yeah.
back to that one thing I mentioned early on about looking at what worked well for the students, because often I have two stories. I saw, a fourth grade math team do this when they were looking at their math scores, and then I saw a kindergarten group that was analyzing their reading scores do the same thing. So in the kindergarten classroom, very experienced teachers, very high performing team, very, well organized. But when they were looking at reading comprehension early in the year, like in December, one of the teachers' scores were pretty much off the charts on a couple of elements. And the other teachers said, oh, she just always does that. Her kids do really well. We kind of have to catch up to her. And then they just blew off of it and went on to what the kids are struggling with. And so I paused because I was coaching the department chair and the grade level chair and the coach to work on their PLCs. And kids say, can we go back to that other teacher? What exactly were you doing? And so I started asking her a couple of questions, and she started talking about some things that she did from day one of school.
Mm.
Some little things that she did while the students were putting their coats away or while they were walking to lunch. The rest of her team, their jaws were on the floor. They said, you never told us that. She goes, well, I started a few years ago. I just didn't think it was that big a deal.
Yep.
Of course, they had more questions than I did. They know that concept better than I do. And so we got through that conversation. And then I made them pause and say, okay, that's when we have to stop and talk about, what worked well. You all now have all of these strategies that she's been doing for months. And they're not little strategies, like she said. They're powerhouse strategies. They're powerful moments. It was an eye-opening experience for them, but it was an example of them skipping over what worked well. And they
Yep.
missed all that information, a wealth of information that frankly would have gone with that lady into her retirement had she not shared it in the PLC.
Exactly. I had a similar one, but even the teacher couldn't figure it out. And we ended up
Mm-hmm.
that other people had to go into her classroom and observe until
Sure,
they could
sure.
figure out what it was that she was doing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's very interesting because it was a writing one. It seemed too simplistic. In the other
Mm-hmm.
classrooms, kids would be writing and then they'd be standing in line waiting for the teacher to look over their
Mm-hmm.
writing and give them feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And she had one thing, as soon as she had one thing that the student could work on, the kid was gone from her and back to their desk working.
Mm-hmm.
So when you looked at a chunk of writing time, her kids actually wrote for longer periods of time during the same time because
Oh,
they weren't standing in line, and that they discovered that teachers were giving kids 3 and 4 pieces of feedback, which by the time they got back to their seat, they were lucky if they remembered one of the 4 that they got.
right, 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 right.
But she didn't know what she was doing that was causing her success.
Right, right, right. A lot of times they don't. That's why it helps to have some, peer observation in there. It can be valuable. Little bits of micro teaching are very valuable. And that's just where we're working on little tiny slices. And maybe we videotape or we go up and observe each other for, how are you conducting the writing lesson? How are you conducting the writing feedback? It can be super, super narrow, but that's exactly what micro teaching is looking at those teeny tiny slices of instruction in a safe environment with each other. It's also one of the things I recommend, for helping with teacher burnout and stress is look at those stress points of instruction, who's doing it well, who's struggling, and then have an honest conversation, give some honest feedback, have a safe environment for doing that. And you're also going to help, mitigate some of the burnout and stress that some of the teachers struggle with in the classroom.
So I've been working with a group of coaches that recently passed 2 questions on to me that they wanted me to respond to related to this. So I'm going to pass them on and let you talk about how you might respond. So the first one was, they asked me this. They said, "What tools or coaching moves can you recommend for supporting teachers' emotional resilience during periods of stress, change, or burnout?"
That's a valuable question because I think a lot of times in coaching and in education in general, we don't talk a lot about emotional intelligence. This is certainly a question that merits addressing emotional intelligence of the staff. I don't remember receiving any instruction on this when I was in university, and I don't remember receiving a lot of training on this as a teacher when I was in the classroom. One of the strategies we have in that chapter on teacher burnout and stress is tactics for managing challenging adult behavior. Many times I see teachers that we might label, or they might label themselves with low, emotional intelligence skills, is they just don't lack basic communication skills for dealing with other challenging adults. And this set of strategies, tactics for managing challenging adults, is there in that chapter on teacher burnout and stress for that very reason. Because unresolved adult conflict is one of the most reliable drivers for teacher burnout, and sometimes even more so than teacher behavior or workload. Sometimes it's just dealing with some of the other adults that everybody considers different people difficult. So it's who I consider difficult to manage with. And some of these strategies are super simple. Just, clarifying intent, using positive intent, agreeing to some norms in a meeting setting. These are some of the strategies that can give a lot of power to teachers to help them with their communication skills, to help them with their emotional management. There was a new department chair we were working with a number of years ago who was totally stressed out. She followed a veteran department chair who was much beloved. She had retired, and this lady came in to take her place. And she had been in the department for a long time. But we were talking with her about 6 weeks into the school year, and she was ready to quit because, her high school English department chair was driving her crazy. She said, and she goes, I can't take this. She goes, these people are my friends. I've known them forever. And so just a little quick conversation with her about what their questions were was a huge tool that helped her turn it around. Because when we wrote down what all the questions were, it turns out all the questions were about the new standards and the new initiatives they were doing in the curriculum. None of the questions that they were shooting at her with these sharp arrows had anything to do with her personality, her leadership style, anything like that. They were all very logistical questions about how to implement this new program. And the department chair, was very smart. She saw the pattern in the questions. We said, they're not attacking you. They're angry about this new implementation. And so we talked about some strategies for managing those kinds of questions. And once she had that, she was able to turn it around. Now, granted, her department was very sarcastic and they were sharp-witted, so they still asked questions with that tone. But she would just kind of ignore the tone and then answer the questions or find a solution to whatever the problems were that they were presenting, which they had not faced before as a department. And within a couple of months, she wasn't complaining about dealing with him anymore. But it was she was emotionally upset at first because she couldn't take all of that being fired at her. But carefully stepping back and analyzing the data, she was able to wrap her head around it and get over that bumpy road at the beginning of an implementation, which many of us know that you face in the beginning. And she's still the department chair to this day and quite successful at it.
Yeah, I just did some work with another author who writes about resistance in coaching, that resistance with teachers that coaches run into, similar to what you were describing this first time with. And she described that if you see resistance as an unmet need.
Yes.
So there's something those people who are resisting need. And so if rather than seeing it as an attack on me, I work on figuring out what that need is, that's a big stress release.
And sometimes it's just it's something that's as simple as a difference in philosophy. You and I could be working on the same science team, but you can have a different approach to students. You can have a different, belief about assessments. You have a different belief about science in general. And and still be just as effective as I am. So if I can just acknowledge some of those differences and still work with you, I don't have to be just like you in order to be successful or for us to work well together. So sometimes it's just acknowledging that, articulating that, maybe over time turning it into inside jokes. Hey, that's the way Steve thinks about kids. And nothing wrong with that, just different from me.
The other place I see that stress come up more often than it should is with a paraprofessional working with a teacher. So now we've got the two people in that classroom or a co-teaching situation where people are actually getting more stress from the adults dealing with each other than they are from what they're looking to accomplish with kids.
Agreed. That's probably one of the number one stressors that special ed teachers bring up to me is how to work with, manage, communicate with their co-teacher in their classroom, or vice versa, the regular teacher with the special ed teacher. And what I often get asked by coaches or by those teachers that, well, what do I do with this person? And so I'm going to go back to that list of, tactics for managing challenging adult behaviors. And that's why it's in there. I'm going to say, okay, well, let's look at these 8 ideas. And let's talk about your personality versus her personality and which ones might help you to get some clarity in the relationship, to get some peace in the relationship, to get some harmony going in the relationship. And many times it's one thing. Sometimes it's a set of 3 or 4 things. Sometimes it's an experiment. Okay, I'm just going to try this for a couple of weeks. If that doesn't work, then I'm going to try this. And I always say, well, that's better than the hell you've been living with, for the past, 3 or 4 years, just giving them something to try.
Experiment. I believe experiment is stress reduction.
Yes.
Yeah. Stress is when you're driving to school, knowing what that kid's going to do and having no idea what you're going to do. That's
exactly.
Stress. But if you have something to try today that you haven't tried before, it's a total different way that you're walking in the door.
And sometimes exciting. I mean, I've done model lessons where I know there are challenging kids in the room, and I think, okay, well, what am I going to do today? Because the teacher's already told me, he does X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to have 3 strategies, my 3 tried and true strategies ready. I'm going to have these other 3 that might work, and that gives me a little bit of hope. It gives me a little bit of excitement as I go into the lesson.
So let me toss the other question that those coaches gave me. How can coaches support teacher well-being in ways that go beyond surface level wellness and actually impact day-to-day professional practice? And I'm thinking that question kind of aligns with your comment earlier about, what can we do within the system the way it is without changing the system? And then are there things we can do that encourage a bigger systemic change within a school?
Well, I think for 2 things. First, coaches in many instances are gatekeepers. They're actually one of those avenues to power. They're one of those avenues to the system, and they have some influence. Sometimes they have some direct influence. Sometimes they just have more partial influence, but they also have a responsibility for making sure that when they have influence, when they have control, when they have a voice, that they use it on behalf of teachers as well. They can often see things that an individual teacher can't see. They can see some things systemically within the grade level or the department or the school or the district, and they need to make sure that they're doing their job to be advocates for the teachers as well. The other tactic that comes up that I found some coaches and administrators can use, many people have seen that strategy for it's often done in circles. We call it circles of influence, where you group the things that you can control in one circle, in a larger circle, things that you can influence, and then a larger circle of things that you can't change or influence. And so when you do that strategy in isolation as a teacher, it is just a Band-Aid. It's just helping you, sort of organize your thoughts and your energy. But coaches and administrators have the power to do that with groups. So when you do that with groups, it becomes much less about just, whining and more about, okay, so what are some things that are out of our control that we need help with? And so it gives you sort of analysis of the systems that are surrounding the teacher. That's a strategy or tactic I would that we have there in that chapter that I would encourage coaches to consider. What are some things that you could do to help with some of the systems? Sometimes addressing the assessment is not the thing that is stressing them out the most. It is the student behavior. So it helps the coach focus where to determine their focus. Do I need to focus on giving them, strategies or tactics or setting up a system for student behavior? They're fine with the assessment. I can work on this other avenue over here to help them. So those are a couple of the tips that I would give to coaches who are looking to see how they could influence and help reduce some of that stress and burnout.
Yeah, I looked at that piece that you had written on circles of influence, and that struck me that could be a very good starting point for an instructional coach to do, both with an individual teacher to have the teacher shed light on their own thinking, but then also with a PLC or larger groups of teachers.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think coaches can do is make sure that their bag of tricks, their repertoire of strategies is broad. And this, in terms of this book, this is what it's made for. So if a lot of times I find coaches, even administrators, they were often pretty successful teachers. They didn't have a lot of classroom management issues. They didn't have a lot of struggle with students who are high needs. Sometimes they were managing those things innately. Sometimes they were managing those things intentionally. But if I had figured out how to manage student misbehavior really easily, I need to slow down and go back and look at some of the basics for classroom management. And that's one of the things I was going to suggest to you today in this chat was, another thing to help teachers with stress and burnout is, as a coach or as an administrator, go in and look, or even a teacher, go in and look at that chapter 2 on classroom management, affective learning gaps. That chapter in particular was vetted by about 16 teachers across the nation. And so they're giving strategies and tactics that they use every single day. Some of the most powerful strategies that they like. And we included some of their stories in there. So as a coach, I would make sure I was fluent in that. If that's the area where my teachers were struggling. When I first became a coach, that's exactly what I did. I didn't have a lot of classroom management issues when I was first in the classroom. I learned later that I was doing a lot of the things that were research-based just sort of innately. But as soon as I became a coach and administrator, it was like the number one issue that teachers were struggling with when I went to coach them. So I just decided it was my job to become a master of this topic. And I did. Every book I could read, every training I could go to, if I went to one conference, for a day and I got 2 strategies that were powerful, I would take them back with me and I would commit them to memory. And not just commit them to memory, I'd write them down and talk about, because I knew I had teachers who needed those. So I would say, check your bag of tricks. Make sure it's broad. Make sure it's deep. Make sure that, and do a little analysis. Make sure that you're seeing what are the gaps amongst the teachers that you need to help them with, and then fill that in. Consult with other coaches. Stay current on your reading, and I think that's what makes a powerful coach and a powerful educational leader.
I'm laughing because a phrase that I used for years with teachers and PLCs is that as a PLC, you sit down, you look at student work, and the question you ask yourself is, what do the kids need us to learn?
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm flipping that, because as a coach, it's really, what do my teachers need me to learn?
Exactly.
So why don't you jump from there into tell us a little bit more about the other areas of your book outside this single chapter that I pulled, and now you talked about the one on classroom management. What are the other issues that you address?
Well, the Teaching Strategy Handbook addresses student engagement. There are a lot of strategies in there. I like this chapter. In particular, there are strategies in there about what the current research says about, student talk. It's important not to just have them turn and talk to each other, but exactly how are they talking to each other? Are they arguing with each other? Are they defending with each other? So it gives you some frames and some structures for that, how to really elevate, turn and talk. So they're actually producing, higher level thinking skills when they're doing that talk. And then a variety of other strategies that we've run across throughout the nation, or we've used ourselves. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the second chapter is on classroom management, and it's just and each one of the strategies is about a paragraph or 2 or 3 long, so they're short reads. And we also chunked each chapter, like I mentioned earlier, into which ones can you do super fast, which ones take a little bit more planning, and which one take some more long-term planning. So that chapter, of course, is one of my favorites because it's also, co-developed by a bunch of current classroom teachers. Academic learning gaps is a powerhouse because it gives specific strategies for when you're struggling with academic gaps. What are some of the most common ones? And what are the lists and lists of strategies that we see teachers using to fill up those gaps? The special needs in the general education classroom, that's one of the stress points for teachers. And so we give the most common and some unique strategies for dealing with special ed students who are in the general ed classroom. Chapter 5 is about technology integration. And it was really exciting because this chapter lines up with a lot of the movement that we're seeing in technology integration today. Where it's more of a parsed out strategy instead of a holistic, we're going to do the whole curriculum based on technology. It's like how to manage some technology free days, how to manage, an overwhelming of technology. There's a lot of, it was very cool to see this chapter come out at the same time that people are pushing back against technology, because we are very much for technology integration, but where it's appropriate, not as a wholesale, use of student reading and student usage throughout the curriculum.
It's an interesting place to be at. That how much of a focus is on getting the technology implemented, and then how much of our focus is seeing that it's not taking over as it's been implemented.
Right, and for the most part, we wrapped up this chapter a year ago, but it was just what we were seeing and we were encountering. And then all of a sudden, now you see in the news and all you're reading, it's exploding that people are pulling back on technology. And we were like, my goodness, we were like right on spot with this one. But it was just what we were encountering. We were trying to offer solutions to problems that we were seeing or that teachers were bringing up in the classroom. So it is fun to be a part of that conversation, to see that chapter aligned with that. Chapter 6 is about family engagement. I love this chapter because it gives some innovative and different ways for families to be involved. There's a big trend now for family group conferences, and to go along with a few individual conferences, but to do more family group training on the very specific things inside your curriculum that that families can do at home. It's sort of, taking the veil off of some of the instructional strategies and curriculum strategies and saying, okay, parents, here's how you can support it, and here's where we need you the most. So to me, that's an exciting chapter. Chapter 7 is on assessment and grading, some ways to make some things efficient and make some things aligned with higher levels of thinking, make some assessments and gradings aligned with some of the harder standards. And then we talked about chapter 8, the teacher burnout and stress. And then chapter 9, cultural competency, inclusivity, and equity. There's a lot of strategies in there. Again, lots of teacher influence in there, lots of strategies for what people have learned over the past 6 or 8 years around equity. And then chapter 10 is sort of a wrap up. It's like, okay, if I'm a teacher reading this, how do I take this and use this information? How do I use it to, it's great to read a book or read a chapter and say, I got some good ideas. But then how do I make these habits? So it's more about how do I establish a habit? How do I establish a routine with some of these things that I want to establish? How to make them a part of my instructional repertoire as a teacher? And that's it. Those are the 10 chapters. The one thing I will say about the book, from people who are reviewing it, we're getting lots of positive feedback about the structure. We were saying it's easy to read. I can just jump to a chapter where I have high needs. And then again, it's segmented into low prep, medium prep, high prep. So I can move within that chapter. And then often the strategies are a short read. They're just a few paragraphs. So I can get a grasp of what I need, maybe a story about how it was implemented in a real classroom, and then go from there. So the format or the structure of the book is getting a lot of positive feedback as well.
Yeah, that's why the format jumped out to me as a helpful resource guide for instructional coaches to have off to the side. Knowing issues that a teacher has raised, and you're looking for some quick possibilities to come back to the conversation with the teacher. Sounds like a great resource there.
If I were an administrator or a coach, let's say I'm working with a teacher on implementing, some rules, routines, and procedures around technology integration. So I might give them my ideas. They might give me some of their ideas. We might come up with a plan. And then I might, after the conversation, is give them a copy of that chapter 5.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you have some time later, here's some other strategies you might read on that same topic. So instead of just handing them the whole book, hand them a chapter out of it.
Yeah. Great extension. Well, I'm super glad that you contacted me to let you know you had a new book out.
All right. Thank you, Steve. And I appreciate you having me on again.
And what's the best way for listeners to follow up with you with a question or kind of follow your continuing work?
I have a website, akyconsulting.com.
Okay.
On that website, you can see sometimes I'll put conferences on that I'm going to. I have podcasts. I have all the publications where you can link to purchase those. And you can sign up. I have a newsletter. It comes out about every 8 weeks or so. Easy to opt out, but you can sign up, give me your email, and you sign up there for that newsletter. You can also email me directly from that website. But I would point people to akyconsulting.com.
We'll stick that in the lead into the podcast, make it easy for folks to find.
Perfect.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, folks. I'd love to hear what you're pondering. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn at Steve Barkley, or send me your questions and find my videos and blogs at barkleypd.com.